Good evening. Thank you for coming. I'll try to keep this as clear and brief as I can. It's a summary of a 60-page article, so if I begin racing at 100 miles an hour towards the end, you'll know why. By way of introduction, I'm going to give you some sense of what will be covered. I'll talk a bit about historiography, sources, and the main theses that are being presented. Then talk about the creation of these diocesan congresses in 1867, how they developed by 1904. And then 1905, which is a kind of rehearsal for 1917, when these congresses suddenly morphed, transformed themselves in terms of composition and above all competence. And then talk about the Church in Revolution. And this is where most of the research recently has been on, which is what role did the Church play in the Revolution of 1917, especially with respect to the overthrow of the monarchy and its relationship with the provisional government. And that's where basically it stops. It's interested in the politics of the Church in the Revolution. My research basically has gone on in two directions. One is to examine the revolution in the church with a capital C. And by way of explanation in English, which you can't do in German, you can distinguish between two kinds of churches. One is church with a capital C, which means the institution. That includes not only, that includes the synod, the bishops, the entire institution. And part of it is this revolution in the church, the radical democratization, etc. And that's part of it. But and the final revolution, which is really the core of my research, is the revolution in the church with a little c, which means the parish, the Gemeinde, Prichot, which is the revolution which follows the initial revolution in the church in the larger C, but by the summer of 1917, power has shifted from the capital C to the small c. And by the fall of 1917, in effect, the small c church is the church. There's not much left of the synod or the church as a grand institution. And the decree of the Bolsheviks in January 1918, in effect, does not invent, it codifies what has already transpired. All power is now in the parish. Sounds familiar. And then I'll end up with a brief conclusion or summary. So by way of introduction, some of the overview of this, so the basic idea here is to rewrite church history. And I've already suggested what that means. That means moving from the capital C to the small c, to focus less upon the institutions like the synod, monasteries, and the service class like the clergy, and to the folk, the believers. That's the key element of what my research has been going. And it's encouched in a larger framework of sociology of religion, which now emphasizes the importance of belief over institutions and distinguish between, and make the fundamental realization that Entkirchlichung, the breakdown of those church institutions, is not the same as Entchristlichung. And the beliefs, the belief systems, the piety and all that, particularly in the Russian case, remains extraordinarily high. If you take the usual markers of religious observance in Western Europe, communion data, where, you know, it's 10, 20%, let's say the Evangelische Kirche, it's going to be 10, 20% in an urban area. At best, in a confessionally competitive area like northern Bavaria, maybe 50, 60%. In the Russian case, right through 1914, it's going to be in the 85, 90% confession rate. Some dip, but not substantial. So the basic point I'm going to be dealing with is understand this process and examine through this one vehicle how the Diocesan Congress, an elected body which is created in 1867 as a clergy institution, is transformed into a Congress of clergy and laity, in which both laymen and clergy are elected and participate in 1917. And by the summer of 1917, how that transformation in the diocese is shifted to the parish below. And by the summer of 1917, it is no longer the church with a capital C or the clergy, but the parish which has power. full power over appointment, funding, religious praxis, whatever the case may be. Historiography. There's a lot of it, and not much of it is very good. I mean, there's abundance before 1917, but it's basically church writing about itself. I could give you details on it, but it's not terribly important. In the Soviets, was anti-confessional. Basically, very little was written between 1917 and 1990. A little uptick in the 1980s. And then since 1990, tremendous flood of dissertations and research. Again, most of it about bishops, institutions, best case scenario, parish clergy, relatively little about believers. Very little about believers. Very few works about the prichod, about the parish itself. Only recently have a few people begun to work on, since 2000, a handful of people have begun working on the parish itself. And on the diocesan congresses, basically before congresses before 17, almost no studies. Very few were done before 1917. It's an irregular semi-institution. Since 1917 to 1990, nothing. Since 1990, basically on the Diocesan Congress in 1917. Because if you're studying what's going on in the church between February and June of 1917, you're studying the Diocesan Congresses, which are overthrowing bishops, seizing power, welcoming the agrarian revolution, etc., etc. And that's where the action is. And that's where most of the research in the last decade has been focused. On the diocesan congresses in 1917, and especially on their political relationship to the regime and to the various social movements. Sources are a problem. The Congress is basically a semi-institutionalized organization. It's created in 1867, but has a very vague charter. Its basic task is to raise money. And there's no real funding, no system to maintain records. The long and the short of it is, the record keeping is dispersed in each diocese. It doesn't get sent to the center, so you have to go out to the boondocks, the archives, or to the Diocesan Gazette. The diocesan newspaper will print the journals. So basically, the sources are are decentralized. That's one reason why Petrograd-centric historiography, right, has ignored the diocesan congresses. They're printed, but the printed ones are censored. And I'll show you an example later on. You really need to look at the archival protocol, stenogram, to see what was really said, not what was really printed. Because the bishop basically approved the resolutions and would edit them, as I'll show you in one of the examples. Not always, but had the responsibility of editing. And some of the basic themes I'll be emphasizing would be the following. First, the creation of a typical Great Reform institution, where the idea was to empower clergy to meet and basically raise funds. We'll give you authority, but the task is to increase funds for the seminary so your sons won't look like they're out of a Bursak, Pomilovsky description of the seminary. From 1867-1904, basically they decline in frequency and in competence, power, even change in composition. There's a decline by 1904. The second major thing will be the Revolution 1905, is revolution in the Congresses. The Congress is a dress rehearsal for 1917. In 1905, the Synod, the bishops, by and large, welcomed diocesan congresses as a way of mobilizing the clergy to become a force in defense of orthodoxy for a number of reasons that we'll be elaborating on later. In 1905, they no longer talked about the seminary budget. In 1901, for example, the Protocols of the St. Petersburg Congress, 250 pages, and it looks like an accountant gone mad. Nothing but numbers about how much should be spent on the washing, etc., etc. Nothing of substance in there. It's amazing how they could spend so much paper on accomplishing so little. In 1905, they're talking about the liberation movement, relationship to the workers and peasants, and above all, radical reform in the church. And that radical reform, I'll come back to it again and again, is basically two things. A, democratization, and in Russian it means application of vybornoye nachalo, application of the electoral principle. And they're talking about, it means we should elect bishops, even elect priests by the parishioners. And the second is laicization. This word appears in the way I'm using it in English in 1870. And usually the laicization terminology suggests the French Revolution. And what laicization means, giving power to the laity, right? Giving power to the laity. Well, the usual meaning of the term is to get the clergy out and the laity in secular institutions, like the school. So you see that in the French Revolution thereafter. That's the typical French meaning of the term. In the English usage since 1870, and the way I'm using it here, it means not getting the clergy out of secular institutions. It means getting the laity into the church, empowering the laity in the church itself, based upon this new ecclesiology of the conciliar principle. The third big thing will be 1917, where in the first 3 months, clergy, laity collaborated in the congresses from the February Revolution until June, agreeing upon the political program, social program, and even vaguely upon the parish question. In the summer of 1917, there's a split between parish clergy and parishioners. And that's a result of a longer process I'll touch upon, but basically parish priests became increasingly ambivalent about empowering the laity. It sounded like a good idea. In 1905, everybody's for it. By 1917, yes, but A, they have no power over current clergy, and B, the parish has to maintain current expenditures for the church. They can't change the status quo until the Constituent Assembly, or at least the Church Council. All right, so I wanted to mention something about consistory. I said you got to go out to the archives, in the Oblast archives, the provincial archives. And the main thing about it is, when you read these protocols, is that they're all complaining about the Diocesan Gazettes. There's nothing they complain more about in 1905 than the Diocesan Gazette, because often you had historians as editors. And when I wrote my dissertation, I was so grateful to these diocesan newspapers because they filled them with archival documents. Well, activist clergy found this a tremendous waste of space, and the Diocesan Gazettes, therefore, are great for historians, but they're bad for the parish clergy. But what they did was preserve that so much has been lost. And my main point here is that in 1880, there was an inventory of the consistory archive in Vladimir. Right? 162,000 files. By 1990, 12,000 are left. This is everywhere. So much was pulped because people didn't value provincials didn't value 18th and 19th century documents. They used them to wrap fish. They sold the paper. If it was something before 1700, oh my God, you got to save it. The Diocesan Gazettes published a lot of these documents, but other than that, they're gone forever. Meaning that in many cases you do not find full records of the consistory, much less the Diocesan Congress. In the old dioceses of 1990, the average of what's left is 24,000. I mean, a tremendous loss. Microhistory is difficult in the Russian case because the microhistorical archives have been devastated. In contrast to the archives of the Diocese of München-Freising, which has parish archival records. That's missing. You don't have that. And even the diocesan records have been devastated. Vyatka is relatively well preserved, but then you run to a place like Oryol, thanks to the war and whatnot, fewer than 500 documents remain. Don't try to do a diocesan history of Oryol. People have tried to do it of Voronezh, which has about 2,000 files. And if you read the dissertations, you see all the references to Yeparchialny Vedomosti, to the Diocesan Gazette. All right, the congresses, they're created in 1867 in the seminary reform of 1867 because of the result, an attempt to make the seminaries improve the quality of life, the quality of instruction. And one way to do that was to have the fathers, the parents involved. Virtually all the seminarians are sons of priests. Virtually all seminarians are sons of priests, because the bishop didn't want peasants studying there and then going off and become, go to the market or something. You wanted people who serve the church. Therefore, the way to make these seminaries better is to have the fathers involved. So you create diocesan congresses, which may meet up to one time a year. And the basic of their task was to raise money. Many of the diocesan congresses in the next 10, 20 years will build candle factories with the obligation that all churches burn votive candles produced in these candle factories with a certain profit. And the idea is you raise salaries, you create more stipends, and the quality of life in the seminaries will be radically improved. After the 70s, basically the congresses declined. In the 70s, they meet every year. In the 80s and 90s, 1 year in 4. Moreover, instead of having elected reps, you have officials being appointed. The local blagochini, which is like a superintendent or a dean. He's appointed by the bishop. It comes from a Kreis of about 10 or 12 churches. He comes and he's not elected. He's simply is really an agent of the bishop. And so it's no longer elected. It's no longer regular. About the only good thing is it expands its competence in the sense that it takes on more clergy responsibilities. It becomes responsible for creating pensions, burial funds for really poor clergy, etc., etc. But it has no responsibility over secular issues before 1905. And as the reform issues intensify in the 80s and 90s, and you see all kinds of problems in the church, tremendous literature on parish reform. We need to make a parish commune come alive again. We need to, two impulses. One is look back into pre-Petrine, pre-Peter the Great, pre-1700. We need to revive the traditional parish, which had been the vital force of popular religious life. We must debureaucratize. We must demoticize, empower the believers to a greater role. And this is filled in the 80s and 90s. But the organ which might have produced and articulated these reforms, the Congress, basically has receded in significance, even in frequency of its meetings. The diocesan congresses of 1905 are really a revolution. Right? This is a dress rehearsal with a quite bit of it's amazing how much is said and done in 1905. And there are 3 reasons. One, priests' sons were a great source of disturbances. Over half of the seminaries erupted in disorders, strikes, even assassination attempts in 1905. And one of the tasks of the Congress will be to come there and figure out how to save their sons from expulsion and permanent exclusion from any formal education. A second cause of calling these Congress is to deal with the law on religious tolerance of 17 April 1905. The Tsar decriminalized conversion from Orthodoxy. After 17 April 1905, you could convert, before this you could convert to Orthodoxy, but you couldn't convert from Orthodoxy. After 17 April, you may convert from Orthodoxy to other faiths, and several 100,000 will do that. What that does is force the church, it makes reform urgent. We must revitalize the church to deal with this enormous new challenge of massive conversion. And the third impulse to these congresses will be the general social revolution, where priests out in these 40,000 parishes, hundreds of miles, kilometers from the nearest authority, are left face to face with peasants and forced to deal with questions of land, or if it's in the city, the question of the labor movement or whatever. The liberation movement is a vital issue in the parish itself. 247 priests will be prosecuted for radical revolutionary activity in 1905. 247. That's about 0.5%, which is based on the Central Archives, which is an underestimate. It's probably 2 to 4 times greater than that if you use provincial archives. All right, so in 1905, you're summoning these congresses, and they're being summoned basically by 3 people, by 3 groups. One is the Synod at the very top. And in April, right after that law on freedom of religious confession, the Synod urges bishops to have pastoral meetings to figure out what to do. And on November 18th, 1905, the Synod encouraged, not merely allowed, encouraged bishops to have pastoral assemblies to discuss what the church must do under these new conditions, not limiting it to the religious affairs. This is authorization from on top. And as the Moscow historian Babkin has emphasized, in 1905 until December of 1906, the Synod played a very neutral role in the revolutionary crisis. And in the fall of 1905 is looking to the parish, not to the crown, for resolution of these problems. The second source of the congresses will be a number of bishops. Some of them are extremely liberal. There are reactionaries, but the number of liberals who encouraged, created, summoned, convened congresses before the authorization came. You have the first congresses meeting in the spring of 1905 before any authorization. And they expand the authority. What's crucial here goes back to the weakness of the Congress. The Congresses were under-institutionalized, right? Not very clear rules. What that meant was tremendous room of maneuver for the bishops. They could be extremely liberal if they chose to be. And a number of them did so, and summoned these congresses in 1905. Gave them broad agendas, and in some cases even allowed laity to participate. And the third dynamic will be parish clergy. By August, September 1905, many clergy are demanding that the congresses be summoned, demanding that the bishop convene the diocesan congress so they can speak to church and social issues. The result of that will be a series of congresses, and a little bit later I'll talk about these 3 examples. But if I look at the case study, general patterns of the congresses in 1905, the main theses would be the following. One is diversity. There is a great deal of variation in when and what the congresses will say and what they were allowed to address, precisely because they're very diocesan specific, depending on what the local authority, the local bishop would favor. Secondly, tremendous expansion of competence. They deal with the seminary issue. That's what they're supposed to do, and that's what they want to do. Their sons are being kicked out of the seminary. On the other hand, they expanded and virtually all of them addressed the questions of church reform and political and social reform. This is, and everything is on the table. Everything is on the table. Even the empowerment of women. Not to mention the election of bishops, changing canon law, changing the liturgy, etc. Parish power. One of the issues they discussed would be parish power. And in 1905, it's almost like intelligentsia. In 1905, most of the priests thought, let's give power to the people. Why should we give parishioners power? Well, partly because it's a way of mobilizing them, making them active, making them activisti, make them active members of the Orthodox Church. Partly it's a way of making a leverage against the bishop, hoping that the parishioners will protect them against an arrogant or abusive bishop. And all that meant basically the idea that we should give parishioners more power. Parishioners should be able to elect their priest, so that he's chosen by them, and the parishioners should control the budget, parish funds. It shouldn't be, 80% shouldn't be siphoned off for the diocesan needs. By January 1906, December 1905, this panacea has become a problem. But it turns out not all the parishioners love their priest. And many parishioners, indeed, prefer to do 2 things. A, choose new priests. B, use parish funds for parish needs. A lot of the parish funds is going to finance the seminary. Who's studying at the seminary? The priest's sons. Et nam nada. We don't need that. It's not to our purpose, and therefore they stop paying up. They stop diverting parish funds for diocesan needs. By the summer of 1906, many of the clergy have become very ambiguous. In principle, they believe in parish empowerment, but there's a great deal of anxiety, as in the case of Intelligentsia after the October Manifesto, about what this revolution can lead to when the masses are really empowered. The period 1907 to 17 is a period of decline. The congresses meet, but go back to the old competence, rarely address big issues. Sometimes they do. In Tver, for example, in 1908, height of Philippine repression, the Congress meets and says, let's talk about electing laity to the Diocesan Congress, 1908. The bishops have no way. But in principle, most of them are reverting to the old pre-1905 pattern. And it's in this period that, well, I'll talk about it in a moment. In 1916, the Synod asked the clergy, should we give more power to the parishioners? And we'll come back to that, and the answer will be definitely no. All right, let's look at three examples. One is Viatka Diocese. Bishop Fielderets is it's very typical, widowed priest. 38% of all bishops under Nicholas II were widowed priests. That means he's not a monk from the beginning. He knows what it's like to be a widowed priest. To have been a priest, once you widow, you cannot remarry under church law, and you either survive somehow alone, or you take vows and become a monk. He took vows, became a monk, and later a bishop. And he takes a very conservative view, however, on the power of the bishop. And his Congress basically published its minutes, and in these diocesan minutes newspaper, everything gets published, no doubt much to his horror. These are the resolutions of the Congress. The Congress decrees, recognize desirable that no new general diocesan sums be spent without the knowledge and consent of the entire diocesan clergy in the person of the diocesan Congress. In other words, Bishop, keep your hands off. We will decide what's spent and on what. I mean, that's incredible. And then they proposed that the Congress give money to the consistory, which just doesn't have a very big budget. And this response was, the consistory, that's the board that helps the bishop rule, the consistory as a state agent should be funded by the state. They hate the consistory. And then the last one is the Congress votes for self-government. This is very democratic and talks about everything should be elected. This is including parish clergy, the bishops, the members of church councils, the synod, the highest body in the church, are to be elected with the participation of the laity. I mean, this is really a democratic principle applied full scale. Vladimir Diocese is ruled by Archbishop Nikko, who's only been there a year. He's another widowed priest. Served for about 4 years and then took monastic vows after he became a widower, and served actually in Vladimir for a while. And he's a very conservative, cautious character, but he answers for whatever the Congress does. And he's very conservative. And they sent him October 17th, the October Manifesto. He gets a telegram. The next day he sends a telegram to the Synod. Is there really such a manifesto been issued or not? He couldn't believe his eyes. And it takes him a while to realize that things have really changed. Well, his encounters with this, with the Diocesan Congress is nevertheless very positive. He allows them to discuss the liberation movement, a number of issues, but he edits. This is a good case where you compare the archive document with the published document and get very different things. So in the archive you see that the clergy cannot remain on the sidelines but must sympathize with the liberation movement in the spirit of the Manifesto of 17 October without joining any political party, but approving what is good and condemning what is bad from a Christian point of view. That's okay. I mean, the Synod itself could go along with that. And then they added another sentence which made his hair stand on end. From a practical point of view, the clergy should be more sympathetic towards a moderate peasant party and approve its program, except for some extreme points. That he took out. So in the archive you see the whole thing. In the printed text you only see the first part. And the third case is Riga Diocese, which is in the Baltics, of course. And here, this is very left liberal bishop. influenced by the discourse in the Lutheran Church, which is undergoing a tremendous conflict between the German dominant clergy and the Latvian, Estonian mass of believers, and latter of whom are calling for a people's church, a Volkskirche. So he's influenced by all of that. And Agafan was a very liberal character. He renames the Congress a Sobor. I mean, it's he gives it a name. Meaning, why? Because this has total competence, and it includes laity. So he calls it, so if you go to the Riga Diocesan Gazette, you find that it's called the Sobor, not the Siezd or the Congress. And this Congress comes out with the most radical kinds of declarations you could imagine. Our church life has not gone as it should. The main cause of this is the fact that Sobornost, the Sobor principle, has been expunged from our life and replaced by a bureaucratic foundation, which has extinguished the living spirit of the church. The Congress of the clergy must invariably lead to a Sobor-based governance of the church with the participation, talking about democratization, right? Election. The local people here are used to, in Baltics, are used to elections and have long dreamed of electing their pastors and getting rid of, in the Lutheran Church, the Evangelische Kirche, the Patronatsrecht, where the German elite choose the pastor and the believers want to choose. The non-Orthodox want that. People in general want that. Of course, this electoral right must be given to all parishioners of legal age without regard to rank or social estate, because all are equal in Christ's church. And this is a really shocker. And it is impossible to deprive women of this right. From the 1890s, you've been building up this. So by 1905, a number of these congresses will talk about giving women equal right in the parish participation. And I briefly mentioned before this 1916 survey of parish opinion. And basically after 1905, 1906, they had learned a lesson that parishioners are not always nice. Right? They may not always love you. And so April 1916, and it's a very, Alexei Beglov in Moscow has been working on this. Basically, in April 1916, the Synod asked all of the dioceses, what do you think about increasing, how can we reform the parish? Should we give the parishioners more power? Now, this is after the problems of 1905-07. And the Moscow Congress said the election of the pastor by the parishioners, without question, is required neither by the canons nor the spirit of the Orthodox Church. And it's extremely dangerous for church life in practical terms. Murom Assembly, the renewal in Vladimir Province of parish life by giving the parish the right to elect the clergy cannot be adopted, given the people's lack of culture. Nikulturnost. All right, no thanks. So they've already shifted, in principle, wanting parish power, in praxis, seeking to limit it, which will be the story of 1917. The Church and the Revolution, I won't spend too much time on this because there's been so much written. The historiographic revolution begins with Babkin, who is a Moscow historian and an old believer, no less, who basically says the Church played the main role, forget the workers, and the soldiers. The Church played the key role in the February Revolution. Most people say it's a bit over the top. But basically his view is that. And certainly most people now recognize the role of the Church. Very few bishops opposed the February Revolution. They are relieved. End of Rasputin. End of state tutelage, meddling, and control. And embracing that revolution you find all over the place. Bishop of Enisis, who later that year will defrock himself by saying, I'm not part of this church, this is not really orthodoxy. And March 3rd, the day of abdication, welcomes the revolution. And within 12 days, virtually every diocese, bishop, and clergy have welcomed the February Revolution. The key issues that will be addressed in the congresses of March through May will be the following. One is virtually all recognize the provisional government. Some, as in Tver, send telegrams to the provisional government and to the Petrograd Soviet. That's exceptional. Mostly they recognize the provisional government. All of them support the Constituent Assembly as a foundation for the new regime. Sorry, I'm going backwards here. Constituent Assembly. and about 80 to 90% favor democratic republic, about 10% favor monarchy, constitutional form, and 10% abstain in the typical diocesan vote. So overwhelming support for a democratic, non-monarchical republic. And then support for the war. They're really enthusiastic about the war. And this will remain right through the summer, which is a growing cause of friction with the parishioners. They're very much committed to the war effort. For 2.5 years, they've been devoting tremendous resources. Even when there's very few funds around, they devote sums to support the military effort. There's conditional religious tolerance. Everybody should be free to practice what they want, but the church should be freer. And they want separation of church and state, but not separation of church and state budget. They want the freedom for the church to act, but they want to keep those state subsidies. They want to keep those state subsidies. They want the head of the state to be orthodox, etc. So there is a general recognition of religious tolerance, but qualified. Social questions, very radical views, but tempered. They take very radical views that all the land, church land as well, should be seized, nationalized, repartitioned to those who till it. The peasant use principle. He who cultivates the land should have access to that land, right? Including church land, but with a big condition. This will happen after the war. This will happen after the war. And so everywhere you find very radical social provisions, but deferred until the conclusion of the war. And the last is the nationality question. Georgia, Ukraine demand to become independent churches, autochthonous. Bessarabia demands autonomy. These are three areas where regional churches demand either total independence. Georgia came first, almost immediately. By the way, Nikon in Vladimir, whom I showed you earlier, was appointed in 1906. From Vladimir goes to Georgia. In May 1908, was assassinated. Not a good place to be a Russian Orthodox cleric. In March, the Georgians declare that they are an independent church. April, Ukraine, Podolia and so forth is doing the same thing. Bessarabia demands greater autonomy, not independence from the Russian church. Most of the diocesan congresses say this is a canonical question that only the Sobor, the National Sobor that will meet in August 1917, can resolve. So they took a pass. They're clearly not enthusiastic, but they use the argument that this, as in some other cases, if it's a canonical question, we don't have to pass judgment. So these war and popular demands, I'm running short of time, so I won't read through them, but basically you have this great promise, whoever cultivates it should have it, then the killer sentence. However, resolution of this question must be done on the basis of justice and Christian love, and hence deferred to the Constituent Assembly. And a similar kind of thing in the labor question by the Chelyabinsk Congress. And the church is very much committed to that war effort. So you have these chaplains, you have these stories of chaplains who march into battle with a cross, which is not a very good weapon that didn't last very long. And you have newspapers being filled with Easter at the front. And then you have some ingenious ways of celebrating Easter, which is unusual, I think, by any measure of standard. This is Christ has arisen, using some sort of shells. All right, the revolution in the church. And basically there are three things here, a couple of things I want to... One is de-Rasputinization. 11 of 67 bishops are overthrown as Rasputinites. 11 of 67 are removed as Rasputinites. Sometimes by the Diocesan Congress, sometimes by the local secular officials, sometimes by the chief procurator. Now that's what the these Russian historians have dealt a lot with, and Rogozny and so forth. That's fairly well known. I guess what's striking about it is the fact that not that they were removed, but the ripple effects. Not only they were removed, but bishops' power was compromised. Bishops everywhere lost their authority. Everyone's vulnerable. About half of the dioceses had disorders, criticisms of the bishop, tumult, even when the bishop was not formally removed. De-Rasputinization is part of the deconstruction of the church structure. And the Reformed consensus in the church itself, if you look at across all these congresses, every diocese had a congress in the next 3 months. And there's agreement on democratization. We should elect bishops, even from laymen. Even the laymen could be elected. Even parish clergy can be elected without, as married parish clergy. This is really radical. A bishop with a wife is pretty much unthinkable. Liturgical reform. Some talk about vernacularization, have the church services in Russian. That's somewhat exceptional. Most of them want standardization and abbreviation. Make it standard and shorter. Seminary reform. Virtually everyone agrees on the need to make seminary education more worldly so that priests can more effectively pursue their mission. More parish clergy support. Well, who's going to oppose that? Everybody gets an increase. We go from gratuities to a salary. So those are the kinds of things everyone can agree upon. And the fifth one is the ringer, empowerment of the parish. In the summer of 1905, absolutely. In 1917, okay, but, very big but, very big but. A, doesn't apply to those already working. And secondly, the clergy should oversee parish elections. We can't turn this over completely to parishioners. Rasputinщина is this, going back to some of these Rasputin, there's Rasputin with Germagan and Ilyador. I mean, this was hardly one of the brighter days of the church. So all you had, some of these bishops who were deep Rasputinized claimed never have had nothing to have never had anything to do with Rasputin, but are removed anyway. This intensifies during the war, and then of course you reach the semi-pornographic level towards the February Revolution. Vladimir Diocese is one of the guys who will be removed. Alexei comes to Vladimir in. I'll finish in 5 minutes. In July 1914, the first thing he does is join the Union of Russian People. Arch-reactionary group. For 7 years, the diocese had refused to recognize it. He not only recognized it, he joined it. And so he managed to alienate everybody in sight. So as soon as he comes in, you get all these kinds of complaints. There he is, anti-governmental, anti-provisional government. And he was really popular. The Congress voted 350 to 0 to remove him, and 20 abstained. Not an overwhelming display of support, to put it mildly. And then he refused to go away. The diocesan committee basically sends the synod a message saying, you've got to get him out of here by June 1st or else. Reform priorities, to give you an example of the typical kinds of reforms. One is Centenier. And these are the fastest possible convocation of the Sabor, the National Church Congress, obligatory religious instruction in state schools, liturgy in Russian, shortening of the liturgy, right? If you read the full liturgy, you're there forever. Permit remarriage of widowed priests, all right? And they can remain priests. This is Toroborachia. Under canon law, you cannot remarry, after you've been consecrated as ordained as priest, you cannot remarry. Right? And their argument is we changed the law and allowed them to remarry and still be priests. Give parish soviets control over parish church schools. And give the parish clergy a salary. Now what you don't see here is even more striking. All power to the parish over the clergy. Nothing about the parish election of priests. Because by the time they have met and produced this document, they have encountered some of the massive opposition and control by the parishioners. And democratization is fairly radical. You see this, elect everybody, including bishops. And Vladimir, these guys are, this is really, everybody gets to vote. So male and female, okay, male of both sexes, male and female. And what really gets you is Orthodox old believers. I mean, the only people who are not going to vote on this were Martians. Basically included anyone conceivable would be allowed to vote in this new democratization. Parish reform was parish control over local finances, but no changes for now. and parish right to nominate future clergy, but not touch those who are in their current positions. And all this is the background to the revolution in the church, in the parish itself. And you have a couple things going on. One is the kind of church capacity. The church is disintegrating during World War I. Its budget is frozen. It's losing staff. Its paperwork is piling up. It's ceasing to file, much less process. 1917 accelerates that process. The church, with a capital C in administrative sense, by the summer of 1917, has virtually ceased to exist. The bishop has lost his moral authority. He has lost his diocesan administrative apparatus. The church, with a capital C, institutionally, has virtually disappeared. When we talk in modern language about state capacity, here I'm talking about church capacity. Between July 14, but especially after February 17, the church institutionally has disintegrated. And the other part is this parish revolution 1917. The language democratization, parish power, parish rights, took effect almost immediately. And you can see some of these early statements in March already. Complaints in these clergy congresses about the Christians are taking over. No one said they could. They've done it anyway. Or in the Penza Congress, receiving news about the arbitrariness, you could go on and on. All this proliferates over the next few months, and by May you find these hectograph documents being disseminated by the parish clergy, emphasizing how they're being abused. And in the end, I won't read through it all, but priests are insulted, expelled, even murdered by May. B.V. Titlinov is one of the founders of the Renovationist movement in the 1920s, one of the radical liberals. And in May 1917, this radical left liberal is saying the only way to save the clergy is to unionize. And so at the National Congress in June, he comes up with this document which basically says that clergy, to defend themselves, must unionize. It's not about clergy and laity. They're not included. The only way to protect the clergy is to unionize. And you see this unionization movement spreading throughout the summer. But the result is, you'll see in this last declaration by August 1917, is the declaration of parish priests where they're talking about, we are powerless. The social revolution of the parish clergy is underway. In 1914, virtually all priests, except for Eastern Siberia, virtually all priests in the Baltics and a few outlying areas, virtually all priests are sons of clergy. By the 1922-24 period, 60 to 75% of all priests are not from the clerical estate. The social revolution, the destruction of the hereditary social estate, has begun in the summer of 1917. And to conclude all this, one, I've talked about the revolution really begins before 1917, which is a criticism of Russian historians. You really begin with February 17. You can look back to 5 and it's already being mapped out. And you miss the big point, the change in the clergy's attitudes towards the parishioners. And the second point is this retasking, that you take an old pre-revolutionary institution and it achieves a new function in 1917. In effect, it becomes the church from February to March and really ruling a decision, making the decisions and setting the agenda. And the third point is the church is adapting to the world, adopting worldly principles. And this is a kickback to the usual view of the church, Russian Orthodox Church, as otherworldly. And my basic thesis is that from mid-19th century, the church has increasingly emphasized the need to go into the world as Christ went into the world with this new Christology. Right? The church must go into the world as Christ did and deal with its problems, temperance, alcoholism, social justice, female abuse, etc., etc. But that meant parish empowerment, meant parish hegemony. And what they failed to realize, the church not only went into the world, what? The world went into the church. And in 1917, the world, the laity, miryanya, the laymen, the believers, became the church. The little c church became the capital C church. Thank you for your attention.